August 9, 1942. The waters north of Guadalcanal are black and unervingly calm. A lone Allied sailor stands watch in the early hours before dawn. The air is heavy. The engines hum at a steady rhythm. Somewhere between exhaustion and routine, his eyes close, just for a moment. He does not hear engines. He does not see signal lights. There is nothing on the horizon that suggests danger. Then he wakes. Across the dark sea, silhouettes emerge where there should be none. Tall superstructures, long hulls, shapes moving with purpose and silence. No running lights, no radio chatter, no warning. A fleet where intelligence reports said there should be open water. For a split second, his mind refuses to accept what his eyes are seeing. Japanese warships, heavy cruisers, advancing through the night like ghosts. Later, men would call them a phantom fleet because they appeared too suddenly, too cleanly, too perfectly coordinated to feel real. But in this moment, reality is unavoidable. Alarms begin to sound. Orders are shouted. Searchlights stab into darkness. And in the seconds lost between sleep and belief, history tilts. What allowed an entire enemy fleet to slip unseen into the heart of Allied defenses begins long before this watch ended. Indecisions, assumptions, and silences that shaped the Pacific War itself. By August 1942, the Pacific War had entered a dangerous new phase. 8 months earlier, Japan's opening blows had shattered Allied confidence across the region. Pearl Harbor, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines. A vast perimeter had been seized with speed that stunned planners in Washington, London, and Canberra. But by mid-1942, that momentum was slowing. At Coral Sea in May, Japanese expansion had been checked. At Midway in June, fleet carriers were lost. A strategic wound that could not be hidden. Now the war was shifting from shock to endurance. Guadalcanal was the first test. The island itself was unremarkable. Dense jungle, malaria-ridden swamps, and a crude airstrip hacked out of coral and earth. But its position mattered. From Guadalcanal, aircraft could threaten supply routes between the United States and Australia. For Japan, holding the island meant maintaining the southern defensive line. For the Allies, seizing it meant going on the offensive for the first time. On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and nearby islands. The landings achieved surprise. Japanese construction troops fled, leaving behind what would soon be called Henderson Field. But the operation was only half finished. The Marines ashore were vulnerable. Supplies were thin. Air cover was fragile. And the surrounding seas were still contested. The Allied naval screen was improvised and uneven. Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley of the Royal Australian Navy commanded the protective force, a mixed group of American and Australian cruisers and destroyers. Many crews were exhausted from days of high alert. Communications between ships were inconsistent. Radar technology existed, but it was still primitive, unreliable at night, and unevenly deployed across the fleet. Visual lookouts remained critical, and they were human. Japanese commanders understood this vulnerability. Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa commanded the Japanese 8th Fleet at Rabaul. Unlike the carrier-centric doctrine that had dominated earlier operations, Mikawa's force was built around heavy cruisers trained for night combat. His ships carried long-range torpedoes, the Type 93 Long Lance, weapons that could strike farther and harder than anything the Allies expected. Japanese crews drilled relentlessly in night maneuvers, using optics, timing, and discipline rather than electronics. Mikawa also understood something else. Speed and silence could substitute for air power. As Allied carriers withdrew to avoid Japanese counterattacks, the waters around Guadalcanal grew quieter and more dangerous. Allied commanders assumed Japanese surface forces would hesitate to operate so close to enemy airfields. That assumption was reasonable by Western doctrine. It was also wrong. On August 8th, as fighting raged ashore, Mikawa assembled his striking force. 7 cruisers and a destroyer slipped south from Rabaul, threading through island chains and narrow straits. They moved without air cover, without radio transmissions, without announcing themselves to the world. To Allied intelligence, the sea appeared empty. That illusion of safety, of distance, of time, settled over the watch stations that night. Men stared into darkness, expecting nothing more than shadows and stars. And in that expectation, the stage was set. The night would soon test whether modern war rewarded technology or punished belief. As night fell on August 8, 1942, the Allied naval formation around Guadalcanal was stretched thin, not by design but by necessity. The invasion fleet had landed thousands of Marines and vast quantities of supplies in a narrow window. Once daylight faded, the immediate priority shifted from unloading to survival. Japanese air attacks were expected at dawn. Carrier commanders, wary after Midway, pulled their flat tops eastward to safer waters. That decision left the cruisers and destroyers alone to guard the transports through the night. The screen was divided into sectors. To the south of Savo Island, American and Australian cruisers patrolled Iron Bottom Sound. To the north, another group watched the open approaches. Between them lay gaps, not empty on charts, but thin in reality. Ships maintained patrol courses, trusting that radar pickets and lookouts would provide warning. The assumption was simple. If the Japanese came, they would be seen in time. Fatigue worked quietly against that belief. Crews had been at action stations for days. Many sailors had slept in short intervals, if at all. Tropical heat lingered even after sunset. Watches were rotated, but alertness dulled. False alarms earlier in the campaign had trained men to doubt their own senses. Seeing something where nothing was expected carried professional risk. No one wanted to cry wolf. Radar, the new guardian of the night, was unevenly trusted. Some ships carried early model sets with limited range and cluttered returns caused by landmasses and weather. Others had none at all. Operators were still learning what the green echoes meant. Visual confirmation remained essential, but the night around Guadalcanal was deceptive, filled with islands, reefs, and shifting shadows. Meanwhile, Mikawa's force was already inside the perimeter of Allied expectations. After passing Bougainville, the Japanese cruisers turned south through the slot, a narrow channel that funneled ships directly toward Guadalcanal. Scouts from Japanese submarines and aircraft confirmed Allied dispositions earlier that day. Mikawa knew the carriers were gone. He also knew time was against him. If his ships lingered after dawn, they would be exposed to air attack. The plan was brutally simple. Strike the Allied cruisers guarding the transports. Use surprise. Use torpedoes first. Then withdraw at maximum speed before daylight. There would be no second chance. As his ships closed in, Mikawa made a calculated decision that defined the night. He would not attack the transports themselves. Destroying the escorts would be enough. The Marines ashore could be dealt with later. Preserving his force mattered more than chasing total destruction. This restraint, debated by historians ever since, reflected Japanese naval culture. Decisive blows followed by disciplined withdrawal. Shortly after midnight, Japanese lookouts spotted faint shapes to the south of Savo Island. They had achieved what Allied planners believed impossible: complete penetration of the defensive screen without detection. No flares rose. No alarms sounded. On Allied bridges, officers scanned dark water that seemed unchanged. A single moment of clarity still existed, a narrow window where recognition could have altered events. But that moment depended on human perception, sharpened by belief. And belief was already compromised. The night was quiet, too quiet. In minutes, the silence would shatter. Not gradually, but all at once, when disbelief gave way to impact, fire, and irreversible loss. Shortly after 1:30 a.m. on August 9, 1942, the illusion finally broke. From the bridge of the Japanese flagship Chokai, Vice Admiral Mikawa could now see the dark outlines of Allied cruisers off Savo Island. They were closer than expected, still unaware, still unprepared. His ships slipped forward in disciplined columns, engines turning just fast enough to maintain formation without throwing up phosphorescent wakes. At 1:38 a.m., Mikawa gave the order. Japanese cruisers swung slightly to port. Tubes were trained. Within seconds, dozens of Type 93 torpedoes left their mounts, slicing invisibly through the water. There were no warning shots, no illumination, Only the silent mathematics of range and angle. Moments later, flares burst into the sky. The sudden white light exposed Allied ships frozen in confusion, caught between night routine and combat reality. On board the USS Chicago, officers scrambled to understand what they were seeing. Reports conflicted. Some believed friendly ships were maneuvering. Others thought the flashes were distant gunfire, not aimed at them. Then the torpedoes arrived. The Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra was struck repeatedly on her starboard side. Explosions tore through her engine rooms. Power failed almost instantly. Her guns fell silent. Within 2 minutes, she was a burning, drifting wreck, unable to respond. Men fought fires in total darkness, unaware that the worst was yet to come. Japanese cruisers opened fire with precision. Shells slammed into the USS Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes. Bridge crews were killed where they stood. Fire control systems were shattered. Ammunition ignited. The night filled with the orange glare of burning fuel and exploding magazines, turning Iron Bottom's sound into a battlefield lit by its own destruction. Orders came too late. Signals were garbled. Radios crackled with fragments of warnings that never formed a clear picture. Each Allied ship fought alone, unsure who the enemy was or where the attack was coming from. The Japanese, by contrast, moved with practiced coordination, firing, adjusting course, and selecting targets with lethal calm. At 1:47 a.m., Quincy took multiple torpedo hits. Her bow lifted, her stern settled. Fires raged from stem to stern. Minutes later, she rolled and disappeared beneath the surface. Hundreds of sailors were thrown into oil-covered water, the sounds of battle replaced by shouts and silence. Still, the attack was not over. Mikawa's ships pressed north, toward the second Allied group guarding the sound. The element of surprise remained intact. Time was compressing. Every minute mattered because dawn was coming, and with it, consequences Mikawa could not afford. The fate of the remaining Allied cruisers now hung on a matter of minutes, measured not in strategy, but in shock, smoke, and human reaction. By 2 a.m., Iron Bottom Sound had become a corridor of burning ships and drifting debris. The USS Astoria fought on despite catastrophic damage. Her crew struggled to bring guns back into action as fires spread through the superstructure. Flames illuminated the ship so clearly that Japanese gunners adjusted their aim with ease. Shell after shell struck home. When her captain fell mortally wounded, command passed amid chaos. Water poured in. Stability failed. The cruiser would linger until daylight, then finally capsize and sink. The USS Vincennes endured a similar fate. Hit by torpedoes and heavy gunfire, she lost power and communications. Fires raged unchecked. At approximately 2:16 a.m., she rolled onto her side and slipped beneath the surface. Hundreds of men were left in the water, clinging to wreckage, calling out into darkness that offered no answers. In less than 40 minutes, 4 Allied heavy cruisers had been destroyed or fatally damaged. The scale of the disaster was unprecedented. Yet even now, the night offered Mikawa one final choice. Ahead lay the Allied transports, crowded with fuel, ammunition, and supplies essential to the Marines ashore. Destroying them could cripple the Guadalcanal operation entirely. But his ships were low on torpedoes. Ammunition had been expended at a ferocious rate. More importantly, dawn was approaching. American aircraft from Henderson Field and possibly returning carriers would soon dominate the sky. At 2:20 a.m., Mikawa ordered withdrawal. Japanese ships turned north at high speed, slipping back through the darkness as they had come. No pursuit followed. Allied destroyers, confused and scattered, lacked clear orders. Some never even saw the enemy clearly. Others fired at shadows. The Japanese fleet vanished before sunrise, intact and victorious. When daylight arrived, the full truth emerged. The waters around Savo Island were littered with wreckage and survivors. Oil slicks burned on the surface. Debris floated in silent testimony. Rescue efforts began amid shock and disbelief. Officers struggled to comprehend how an entire cruiser force had been shattered without ever forming a coherent defense. The term Phantom Fleet began circulating almost immediately, not because the Japanese ships were imaginary, but because they had appeared, struck, and disappeared with a completeness that defied Allied expectations. Radar had not saved them. Doctrine had not saved them. Experience had not saved them. Only later would investigations identify the chain of assumptions, fatigue, and missed signals that allowed the disaster to unfold. But for the men in the water, and the crews still fighting fires aboard dying ships, explanations were meaningless. What mattered was loss, and that loss would echo far beyond Iron Bottom Sound, shaping decisions, careers, and the future of naval warfare in the Pacific. The battle was over. The consequences were only beginning. By morning on August 9, 1942, the scale of the disaster crystallized. For heavy cruisers, USS Astoria, Quincy, Vincennes, and HMAS Canberra had been destroyed or fatally damaged. Hundreds of sailors were dead. Many more drifted in the oily waters, clinging to wreckage. Rescue efforts were hampered by lingering Japanese presence, ongoing air patrols, and the chaos of night. The survivors faced exposure, dehydration, and the psychological shock of having watched comrades perish almost instantly. The losses were not merely numerical. The U.S. Navy lost approximately 1,600 men in the engagement, and the Australians suffered more than 160. Material losses totaled tens of thousands of tons of warships sunk or disabled, representing both a tactical and symbolic blow. Allied command reacted with shock and anger. Rear Admiral Norman Scott, who survived and later took command during subsequent actions in the area, expressed disbelief in his official reports. The night attack had been perfectly timed, executed, and concealed. Naval officers quickly recognized that Japanese night fighting proficiency, combined with torpedo superiority, had created conditions for a disaster few Allied commanders had imagined possible. The U.S. Navy's preconceptions about night engagements were shattered. Training focused heavily on daytime maneuvers, gunnery spotting, and air coordination, leaving gaps in night tactics. The Japanese had exploited these gaps fully, demonstrating mastery over stealth, timing, and firepower. Initial analyses by Allied intelligence attempted to rationalize the failure. Radar reports were reviewed, communications logs dissected, and lookouts interrogated. Some commanders blamed fatigue and human error. Others highlighted flaws in radar coverage and night doctrine. Historians would later describe the event as a classic example of overconfidence combined with technological misunderstanding, the very Phantom Fleet phenomenon that had left sailors stunned when they first saw it. Even in the midst of tactical disaster, one fact remained clear: the Japanese withdrawal was deliberate. Mikawa had not pursued the transports, sparing the Marines ashore from immediate annihilation. This decision, debated among historians for decades, reflected the strategic caution of Japanese naval culture, a desire to secure a victory without risking annihilation in daylight air assaults. The psychological impact on the Allied forces was profound. Survivors of the engagement described a lingering disbelief. How could such a coordinated strike go undetected, leaving 4 cruisers destroyed before proper response? Reports highlighted a recurring phrase in officer diaries and later interviews: it was as if the fleet simply appeared, and then vanished. In the days following the battle, the full strategic consequences became apparent. Allied naval planners were forced to reconsider assumptions about night operations. The U.S. Navy accelerated training in night gunnery, radar interpretation, and torpedo defense. Ships were reorganized into tighter screens, and destroyers were increasingly tasked with picket duties to detect enemy movements before they reached the main fleet. Henderson Field, the airstrip on Guadalcanal, became a focal point for protecting naval forces, with patrol aircraft assigned to monitor approaches at night and day. The psychological toll extended beyond the immediate losses. Survivors spoke of the Phantom Fleet as if it were a living entity, striking without warning and leaving no trace. This perception shaped morale, feeding caution and hypervigilance in subsequent engagements. Officers carried the weight of having misjudged Japanese capabilities. Sailors adjusted their routines to compensate for the possibility that what could not be seen might still destroy them. On the Japanese side, The operation was deemed a tactical success. Mikawa had demonstrated the effectiveness of night tactics, superior torpedoes, and disciplined fleet coordination. Yet historians note that his restraint, leaving the transports untouched, prevented a complete strategic blow to the Guadalcanal invasion. The decision preserved his ships for future engagements but left the Americans and Australians with sufficient forces to hold the island, ensuring that Guadalcanal would become a protracted struggle rather than an immediate catastrophe. Subsequent analyses, both contemporary and modern, highlighted key lessons. Human vigilance, no matter how dedicated, could be fatally compromised by fatigue and expectation. Technology was only as effective as its integration and training allowed, and disciplined night operations could offset numerical or material superiority. The battle became a case study in the dangers of underestimating an opponent, even when intelligence reports suggested safety. Iron Bottom Sound, named for the countless ships that would eventually rest there, became a symbol of the deadly efficiency of night attacks and the vulnerability of complacency. The waters themselves, calm during Mikawa's strike, had turned into a graveyard of misjudgments, human error, and technological limitations. A stark reminder that in war, the unseen often carries the greatest threat. By mid-August, the Allied command had begun implementing lessons from the night attack. Changes to night patrol routines, radar coverage, and tactical doctrine would slowly reduce vulnerability. Yet the memory of those lost at Savo Island lingered, a haunting acknowledgement of how quickly calm seas could transform into a scene of devastation. The night of August 8th to 9th, 1942, endures as one of the starkest lessons in naval history. That war is as much about perception, vigilance, and human endurance as it is about ships and firepower. A single moment, a sailor closing his eyes for a brief respite, became emblematic of vulnerability. The so-called Phantom Fleet was not magic or myth. It was the product of discipline, training, and the exploitation of assumptions. Iron Bottom Sound reminds us that technology alone cannot prevent catastrophe. Radar, lookouts, and doctrine all failed to stop a force moving silently, deliberately, and with lethal precision. Fatigue, overconfidence, and expectation compounded the danger, proving that even experienced crews could be undone by the interplay of human and material limits. Yet there is another layer, restraint and calculation. Mikawa's decision not to attack the transports spared countless lives and allowed the broader Guadalcanal campaign to continue. Victory in war is rarely absolute. It is measured in risk management, timing, and understanding one's own limits as well as the enemy's. For the sailors who survived, for the officers who recorded what they could, and for history itself, the battle represents a convergence of chaos and discipline, human frailty and tactical genius. It is a reminder that the line between routine and disaster is often thinner than a single watch on a darkened deck, and that vigilance, courage, and understanding the unseen can mean the difference between life and death. The sea holds its stories in silence, but moments like this ripple through history, not as legends, but as stark, enduring truths about the costs and complexities of war.